can be described in a structure. Once you have the structural theory formulated, you can describe it in terms of the three mental agents. That is ego, id, ego, and superego. Yes. And typically, there might be conflicts between the id and the ego. And mostly these are conflicts between drive, instinctual impulses, and the self-preservative instincts, which are the ego is in charge of. And you may have a wish that endangers your life, and the ego say, can't be done. It costs you your life, you know. And so that's the type of id-ego conflicts, mostly between the drive and the self-preservative instinct. They are id, ego, superego conflicts. And these are the typical neurotic conflicts. The ego and the superego are one and the same structure. The superego is a differentiation, a specialization of a part of the ego, which gets the introjects from the environment and then it makes an agency and gives it the authority to control behavior and it rules. It's like having a quiet little dictatorship inside the mind at some point. It's id, ego, and superego. And this type of conflict, which are the typical neurotic conflict, tend to produce guilt. Now, there are conflicts, on the other hand, between ego ideals, the ego and the ego ideals. Okay? Which means the reality of the resources of the ego and ego ideas that may have developed that are well past the capacity of the ego to achieve it. And when you fail that way, then you have shame. But this is not as bad as guilt, generally speaking. Then there are conflicts between opposite ego ideals, which is the case of the word neurosis. And if you saw the tape, you saw that well explained. There is a conflict between the war ideals and the peace ideals. And the contrast between them. We are all brothers and sisters in the world and not enemies and so on, and treat everybody well as you want to be treated, and then go and kill everybody inside. I mean, not everybody can adapt to that fast and have problems with it. Now, so that's between the opposite type of, not different type of ego ideas that may be, like in this case, the peace and the war ideas. They are opposite ideals. And there are some similar mechanisms in traumatic neurosis. In fact, Ernest Jones, which was a famous analyst, as you know, wrote something interesting in 1919 that I will read to you. He says that the difference between a traumatic neurosis during peacetime, yeah, like in Turkey, the earthquake, the earthquake, and a war neurosis was that, quote, with the former, in peacetime, the ego is strong but surprised, suddenly caught by the event. But with the latter, that is the war neurosis, the ego is prepared but weakened. One of the conditions for a trauma is to catch unprepared. The more unprepared you are, the more traumatic. A trauma, after all, is nothing else but an overwhelming situation for the ego that loses all the capacity to deal with it, and essentially it is rendered completely helpless. Yeah, and obviously that's if you know that something bad is coming, you get prepared for it. And though it still will hit you real hard, it's completely different that it suddenly hits you without you having any knowledge or having any preparation for it. That's why you have heard me say many times in cases of children and hospitalizations and so on that you have to prepare them. Explain things, explain what is going to happen to them, and whether it is pain involved and so on. You shouldn't hide any of that, like many parents tend to do and some doctors tend to do, because all of that does is facilitate a traumatic situation, which could otherwise have been avoided if it had been handled properly.
Why would the ego be weaker in the war situation?
I assume because of the conditions of the war, yeah.
So just get worn down?
Yeah,
Depleted?
sure. It's not a normal, like being at home and sleeping in your bed kind of situation. So I assume that really...
the ego functions don't have the same meaning.
Yeah, no. Now, the conflict can as well be described as intersystemic, which is between the different systems of structure, ego and superego, and we already did that. Or intrasystemic, we did that too. That's the existence of some contradictory tendencies and instinctual pair of opposite. And we mentioned that earlier, love and hate, activity and passivity, and so on, and the conflict of bisexuality. And of course, as you know, as Freud developed his theories, he finally describes the major conflict or situation between the life and the death instincts, and that's what life is, a struggle between the life and the death instincts. And that manifests itself in a variety of ways. Now, once he did that, the problem was, as I told you once, that it was not easy to show the death instinct. It's very difficult to demonstrate the death instinct clinically. Theoretically, it makes a lot of sense, and the arguments are there, though most analysts don't agree with that kind of formulation, actually. But it was very attractive to Freud till the end of his life. And I personally find it interesting. So he says that the following were indications of the aggressive or destructive instinct. For example, the masochism inherent in so many people. Another example of it will be the negative therapeutic reaction, the neurotic sense of guilt, and so on. In any case, the conflicts in the history of psychoanalysis were first formulated between the sexual and the ego instinct. That was the first formulation. Essentially, that was the ego instinct, meaning the self-preservative instinct. Yeah. And they still exist, but that was the whole formulation. That was because psychoanalysis is a theory of conflict. How the conflict was understood has changed dramatically through the years, as you have seen. We have covered that. But then later it was between the libidinal ego instinct and the libidinal object instinct, self and object. A little bit of what we talked the other day in terms of the libidinal positions, where the libido is, whether it is in the self, whether it is distributed between the self and the object, and so on. And finally, of course, in the last part of his life, it was between the life and the death instinct. Now, when there was this topographical theory, which was changed to the structural theory, the contrast in the topographical theory was between the conscious mind and the unconscious mentation. That was a conflict. And as you see, that fits the definition of neurotic conflict because one of the elements in the question has to be unconscious. And so it was between the unconscious and the conscious aspects of the mind. That created a lot of problems because there are three types of unconscious. There is a descriptive unconscious, which means everything that is not conscious is unconscious. There is the systemic unconscious, which means the system unconscious as a system, just like there is a system conscious and the system preconscious. And then there is, the first one was the descriptive unconscious. What is not conscious is unconscious. The systemic refers to the system. And the dynamic unconscious is that is the unconsciousness of the preconscious, which means it's something that is unconscious, but that an attention cathexis can bring it into consciousness. And so when the term unconscious was used, and this was one of the difficulties of the topographical theory, you didn't know which unconscious was being referred to, and you always had to stop and say, he means in the descriptive sense, is he meaning in the dynamic sense, or is he meaning in the systemic sense? And this kind of complications created an enormous amount of difficulty. So finally, he abandoned that model, not completely. That model was kind of sucked into the structural theory, because in the structural theory, there are unconscious aspects, preconscious aspects, and conscious aspects. But now it's ego, and superego. And it's the ego and the superego that has conscious and preconscious aspects, and even unconscious aspects to the ego, because the defense systems is all at an unconscious level, and it's an ego function, the use of defenses. But that unconsciousness is different from the unconsciousness of the id. All right? All right. Another interesting question that people used to ask and argue about is, can we influence conflicts, and how? And we have been talking about that. Which type of conflict you can. Certain things that look like conflicts, they are descriptively the same, yet they can be touched by the tools that we possess, and one has to be alert to the fact that there are these differences, that the facade is not the same that of what is behind the facade. And some people ask whether conflict can be solved finally and for all time. This is something that Freud himself, in his way of writing, he asks a question, then to produce his answer, and I give it to you in a moment. Can we inoculate patients against conflicts in the future? In other words, just because you solve the conflicts of a patient now doesn't mean he will never have them. He will have no conflicts ever again. And can we activate the sleeping conflicts, and it is wise to do so? And that's mostly a reference to some complaints that some forensic followers have, that assume that because Freud didn't touch certain aspects of forensic psychopathology, forensic had problems. In reality, what he developed was pernicious anemia, but at the time they didn't know that and had assumed that it was a functional phenomenon. Now, in relation to the first question, Freud says that is, can conflict be solved finally and for all time? He says economic considerations are essential. If the strength of the instinct is too much, we might not be successful. For the second and third question, he said, and we discussed that earlier, that obviously the strength of the instinct is of an enormous magnitude. That's a genetic given. We may not be able to do anything about that, nor about the consequences that has in what gets imprinted into the brain for the fact that you have such a strong aggressive drive, for example. In relation to the second question, can we inoculate patients against conflicts in the future, and can we activate the sleeping conflicts? And if he wants to do so, he says, quote, tempting as it may be for our therapeutic ambition to propose such tasks for itself, experience bid us reject them out of hand. If an instinctual conflict is not an actual one and does not manifest itself in any way, it cannot be influenced by analysis. There's no way of bringing it into the analysis. All right? So that should give you a pretty good idea of the different type of conflict, how you look at them, what they mean, what kind of symptoms they lead to, usually in relation to what type of conflict they take place. It gives you some feeling for the prognosis, and for where you have to go in forms of the treatment. In other words, it's telling you something about the fabric of the neurosis, of the psychoanalytic theory of the neurosis. And the more you know how that, assuming that, to use a metaphor, that the neurosis is a watch, like a clock or a watch, it tells you how it gets put together, how the pieces go together and how they started to work, And if you know how that happened, you'll be more able to fix the watch or the clock than if you have no idea of what the pieces are that went into the fabric of the watch, And so that's an important comment. The other one that we wanted to deal with a little bit and is the symptom formation. This is, as you see, this is a very old graph, some 40 years old. It was in London at the time. It was done by a lady, she's an analyst now in San Francisco, called Eleanor Dansky. And this went to the Concert Research Group. People will discuss it. People who have read all the material anyhow, and then make suggestions on things of that kind. This one, because I left England, never got published. Otherwise, it would have gone into another volume that we were preparing, but since I left, it never got done. In any case, it says here, as a definition, and she's going through all of Freud's work, finding all he had to say about symptom formation. So, the comments that you read here, some come from very early on in his development of the theory, some come from very later on, but as you see, there is an enormous consistency between them, though obviously as he develops the theory, they get refined, you know. Now, the definition given here is a neurotic symptom arising from a failure of repression and is in the nature of a compromise between the id and the ego, the superego. That's a neurotic symptom, okay? Now it says a failure of repression, but at the time in which this formulation was produced, repression was synonymous with defense. So he's not meaning repression as a mechanism of defense by itself. It may have been any type of defense mechanism that didn't do the job of containing the impulse, yeah? Whether whatever it was, a failed reaction formation, failed sublimation, or whatever. I think you read that, so I'm not going to be too repetitive about this. Now, this is the early historical background, which is in page 2, and it says that neurotic symptoms had meanings. It means symbolic meanings, okay? In other words, they are symbols with meanings in terms of the personality and the conflicts of the personality. And this was first discovered by Freud's collaborator in the studies on hysteria. In the study and cure of a case of hysteria, that was in 1880 to 1882. So, as you see, it was Joseph Breuer that actually made that discovery. And that symptoms vanish when their unconscious base is made conscious, which was one of the tenets of the treatment at the beginning, to turn the unconscious conscious. And that, generally speaking, helped to dispel the symptom. Well, it's not that simple, but that is still true, because it means that you put now under the control of the ego, rather than it being trying to produce derivative, bypassing the ego and the superego and get it into consciousness, into behaviors that will create problems and things of that kind. But it's not as simple as making the unconscious conscious. As you know, it requires a lot of working through, as we have been talking about, and without that you don't get anywhere. Otherwise it'd be very simple. With experience, you frequently see a patient and you know exactly what the problem is, you know, and where it came from. You tell him that, doesn't do anything. So it's not a matter of making the unconscious conscious. It's a matter of making the unconscious conscious in a way that it has meaning for the patient, that is acceptable for the patient, that has truth, validity, credence for the patient, you know, that the patient can see, I can see it, you know. It's not a matter of simply becoming an oracle and giving a prediction of what the problem is or where it came from and so on. In any case, it talks a little bit about hypnosis and the cathartic method at the beginning and so on, and little bit by little bit, during these first 10 years, a theory developed which gave an account of the origin, meaning, and purpose of the neurotic symptoms. And it says there, and this is a quote from the introductory lectures, the factors that made up this theory were emphasis on instinctual life, on mental dynamics, on the findings that the most obscure mental phenomena have a meaning and cause, on the theory of psychical conflict. See, the idea of psychological forces in conflict was there from the very beginning, and of the pathogenic nature of repression. Repression here again meaning of the defense activity. On the view that symptoms are substitutive satisfaction. Remember, a symptom is always a solution. It's a bad solution, but it's a solution, but it's always a satisfaction at the same time, that substitute for the original satisfaction that is being sought, or look for, And on the awareness of the etiological importance of the sexual life, particularly the beginnings of infantile sexuality. This was novel and revolutionary and created an enormous amount of waves in those days, because Freud was saying that in fact sexuality started early on in life, and children have, a sexual life, and the component instincts of the sexual life were manifested from babyhood onwards, and got organized, and how they got organized. And now that is very simple and generally accepted. In those days, he was like the devil incarnate, saying that children were sexual. Okay.
Just maybe think about something. I wonder if, like, pedophiles pick children at the age of their own fixations and own developmental conflicts. If there would be a parity between what they seek.
In some cases that may be true.
And what their own conflicts
Yeah.
are.
In some cases that may be true, not necessarily always, no.
Sometimes it's a sociopath.
Yeah, in some cases that may be true. Then he talks about the symptoms being a substitute satisfaction, from the one that is being denied. And as you see, from the very beginning, Freud did stress that neurotic symptoms are disguised, distorted substitute for sexual gratification, and that they are compromises between opposing psychic forces. Now, this is in the, and I read to you the quotation that comes from the introductory lecture. The rejected libidinal longings manage to pursue the course by circuitous path, though not indeed without paying toll to the prohibition in the form of certain disguises and modification. These circuitous paths are the ways of symptom formation. The symptoms are the new or substitute satisfaction necessitated by the fact of the frustration. And you can see the similarity with the dream work. You remember when we were talking about the dream work, that they were substitute for the original thing and so on. Now, here you only hear about the sexual drive, rejected libidinal longings. And you say, well, where is the aggressive drive? Well, in those days, the aggressive drive was a component instinct of the sexual drive. Okay. So it hasn't been separated on its own. And so frequently it was inbuilt into it, but it was not as visible because it hadn't given the status that it later had acquired, when it became on a par with the libidinal drive. Here, it was a component instinct of the sexual drive. And that's why frequently he is only mentioning the libidinal aspect of things, because included in that is the aggressive drive. Otherwise, one gets very confused about these things.
When I was reading this, I kept making notes and saying, well, gee, where's the aggressive drive? Doesn't make sense. But then in your lecture, you kept saying, when you talked about this, you always said both. And so that, you said that.
So he then says, a symptom is a sign of and a substitute for an instinctual satisfaction which has remained in abeyance. It is a consequence of the process of repression. Repression, remember here, means defense, proceeds from the ego when the latter, it may be at the behest of the superego, refuses to associate itself with an instinctual cathexis which has been aroused in the id. All right? So as you see, all of this, then he talks of symptoms that compromise formation, and we have discussed that are nausea now. They are compromised formations, and they are expressed in different ways, as we were saying a moment ago. For example, this hysterical example, the conversion symptom has both the defense and the instinct represented in the very conversion. In the case of obsessional symptoms, it's in two stages. One gratifies a drive, the other one gratifies the defense. And they are not there simultaneously. You see one first and the other appears later. It's an example of the fellow that in the morning, sends his wife to, hell because the coffee tastes so bad and she can't even do good coffee and he has to go to work without coffee, and so he goes and the coffee, there is nothing wrong with the coffee, he's just in bad mood probably, and expressing his aggressive feeling displays into the wife for whatever reasons. And then sometime later in the day when he comes home, he says, I haven't given flowers to my wife in a long time. So he goes into a flower shop and comes with a bouquet of flowers and gets to the house and says, look what I got for you. And the wife says, you know where to put them, no? Because she's very offended and angry from the morning. He's not trying consciously to make peace with her. It's an unconscious mechanism. The first one is the doing, the second one is the undoing. But neither of them is conscious. He's not conscious of what he did in the morning and why he's trying to correct that in the afternoon. It's in two stages. The one gratifies the impulses, the other one gratifies the superego.
So an apology isn't an instance of undoing because it would be consciously connected to the act itself.
If it is an apology, yes, because that's a conscious activity. I mean, he says, I did something wrong and I need to apologize. That's different. That's different. No, these are unconscious processes. Okay. So that you see how this is all over the place. She gives any number of quotations here about this. I read you the one let me read you the one in the middle, the 1914. It says, psychoanalysis recognized early that every neurotic symptom owes its possibility of existence to a compromise. Every symptom must therefore in some way comply with the demands of the ego which manipulates the repression. It must offer some advantage. It must admit of some useful application, or it will meet with the same fate as the original instinctual impulse itself, which has been fended off. All right? And as you see the close similarity with what goes into the manifest dream, that it has to be changed and distorted in a way that is acceptable in consciousness, and this can fulfill the role of the wish fulfillment in a very displaced. If it doesn't do that, then there can be no dream. Right? And this is the same thing in terms of the symptom. The symptom has a utilitarian value. It has to, otherwise another symptom has to be chosen. That symptom wouldn't be good enough. Now he talks about repression and failure of repression, but here what it means, this is from very early on. Again, repression here means defense, the failure of defense. And this is from very, very early on. And obviously, the defense has to have failed in some form, because if it was successful in keeping it at bay, then the symptom wouldn't be produced, So there is obviously a failure of the defense activity for the symptom to be produced as a compromise to solve the conflict. Because it's like with the dream, you remember? The dream could not take place unless certain conditions took effect. And this is very, very similar, So there is a lot of talk about this type of role of the compromise formation in the symptoms. Let me see. There are some that are more representative than others. In page 5, in the third paragraph, it says, in all neurosis, the pathological symptoms are really the end products of such conflicts, which have led to the repression and splitting of the mind. The symptoms are generated by different mechanisms, and this is important, either as formation in substitution for the repressed forces, right? As compromise between the repressing and the repressed forces, or as reaction formation and safeguards against the repressed forces. So it's 3 different ways that they can produce themselves, and I'm sure you can think of examples of that. A symptom, in the last paragraph, says, arises from an instinctual impulse which has been detrimentally affected by repression. If the ego, by making use of the signal of unpleasure, and this is important, and we haven't discussed this and need to, attains its object of completely suppressing the instinctual impulse, we learn nothing of how that has happened. We can only find out about it from those cases in which repression must be described as having to a greater or less extent failed. In this event, the position, generally speaking, is that the instinctual impulse has found a substitute in spite of repression, but a substitute which is very much reduced, displaced and inhibited, and which is no longer recognizable as a satisfaction. See the similarity with the dream? Very similar. Now, the thing that we haven't discussed is that at some point Freud developed in a book that he wrote in 1926, I think, called Inhibitions, Symptom, and Anxiety. He developed the theory that anxiety was a signal that was produced in order to raise the alarm and force then it's like, I don't know, like an alarm here if somebody tries to intrude, you know, the alarm goes off and everybody becomes aware that there is a potential problem. That's called signal anxiety. And in any type of conflict, what leads to the defensive mechanism is a signal anxiety. The moment that either through the ego itself or through the superego agency imposing it on the ego, danger is visualized, so the objection to any type of instinctual gratification is in the foreground. Then a signal anxiety is produced, and then that forces the ego to produce a defense mechanism in order to control. Otherwise, what is a signal anxiety will become overwhelming anxiety, and the function of the signal anxiety is precisely that, is to prevent an overwhelming anxiety overcoming the ego. The ego is terrified of being put out of action because it's very dangerous, obviously, you know, in terms of the self-preservative instinct. So he developed that, which is very interesting, and then later on other people has discussed in a variety of different ways, and you probably have heard some people that have come here talk about this. Some people like Brenner, for example, Charles Brenner, which is a good theoretician, a very good analyst, now essentially retired. He wondered why only anxiety as a signal, why no any number of other affects as well have the same function, whether it is depression or fear or whatnot, and that all of them constitute anxiety signals to which the ego will react, and there is something to be said by that. Of course, the idea of Freud was that, and it is in a way makes more sense because it simplifies it. It means that, yeah, you get frightened, and that creates a signal anxiety. you get depressed, and that creates a signal anxiety. In other words, everything is retranslated into a simple system that then triggers off the mechanism. Because if you think of each one of them independently, then you have to assume that all of them use the same mechanism and get to the same places and produce the same responses ego-wise, and all of that is very difficult to determine and seems a lot more complex than just having a way of dealing with all the affects by raising the signal anxiety, and that mobilizes the ego forces. You see the complexity of the problem? Though in a way, when you say, well, why not depression being a signal to the ego too, that something is very wrong, and in a way it is. Freud's way out of that was that everything gets translated into this signal anxiety. Brenner would be more inclined to think that any affect could have that function. So now he's talking now of the childhood conflicts and symptoms, and that's what we have discussed many times here too. Now, that all later neuroses are based on the earlier infantile neurosis and the earlier conflicts, and that the earlier phases of development and the fixations and regressions and the neurotic conflicts that were left behind, and the infantile sexuality is represented in the adult neurosis. It's not only the infantile sexuality, the aggressive drive is involved in that as well. But remember, frequently you only hear about sexuality because aggression is considered to be a component instinct of the sexual drive, and this is a quote from 1909, where still they were together, you see. Now, to be repetitive, since we have talked about this a lot, it says here, infantile sexuality, which is held under repression, in other words, is defended against, acts as the chief motive force in the formation of symptoms, and the essential part of its content, the Oedipus complex, is the nuclear complex of the neurosis. And we have discussed that in great detail in the past, and how that happens and why it happens and all of that. Then she collected some of the quotations that is symptom formation in relation to the topographical theory, what I told you before, that it was then the conflict was between the unconscious and the preconscious conscious mental apparatuses, and that later got transformed, of course, into the topographical theory. And the reason for that essentially was the difficulties that there were with the three types of unconscious, and how difficult it was to really discern which one was being referred to. You have to stop and think which one is being implied, and sometimes you couldn't quite do that either clearly, So she has a number of quotes there. If you read them, you will see what they are. They are interesting, all of them. Then there is a structural theory and symptoms, and that obviously is quite a step forward in terms of understanding of how the mind works and conceptualizing everything, conflicts, defenses, the organization of neurotic problems and things of that kind, Then there are dreams and symptoms, and here we are in the phase where we were talking, as you remember, when we did the dream theory, the similarity between the formation of dreams and symptoms that was mentioned by Freud as early as 1895. That is probably in the studies, in the project for a scientific psychology, which, as you know, was not published until 1952, but he already published, wrote about it there. So as you see, he had that idea in his mind since that time, and as you have seen in the other quotations that we have read, there is an incredible similarity between the two, and the mechanisms that are involved are pretty much the same: displacement, condensation, and when in the dream is condition of representability, here is suitability to, produce a substitute satisfaction of some sort, otherwise it can be used, Now, he says the pathological mechanisms which are revealed by the most carefully analysis in the psychoneurosis bear the greatest similarity to dream processes. The most momentous conclusions follow from this comparison. That's in the Project for the Scientific Psychology in 1895. Now, he developed that later in greater detail. If you go to the next page at the top of it, he says it is enough for a dream to be the wish fulfillment of the repressing thought, for a dream is kept apart from reality. But a symptom which has its place in actual life must be something else as well, the wish fulfillment of the repressing thought, right? In other words, in the dream is just the dream wish, which is an instinctual satisfaction. In the symptom, he says there has to be something else as well, and that's a wish fulfillment of the repressing thought, that is the defensive forces. A symptom arises where the repression, the repressing thoughts can come together in the fulfillment of a wish. And the best example is the one I gave you, the hysterical fist. Okay? Thus, he says, the meaning of the symptom is the fulfillment of a pair of contradictory wishes. Now, all of that is incredibly important, and you should keep it always in the foreground of your mind. I tell you why. Because when you see a symptom, you have to see behind the symptom. The symptom is just a description. What I told you of the microphone early on. I mean, you are describing that it's great and it's a microphone, but you're not saying anything about the qualities of the microphone, the bulbs, what kind of range of frequency is capable of recording, and things of that kind. So in the symptom, all you hear is a description of what is happening to the patient, but you have to look behind that description, and it's possible to find out what is the drive that is looking for satisfaction, that is being negated and only being given in a displaced kind of form, in a disguised kind of form, in a substitutive kind of form, and what is the defense that is involved in it. And as you remember from a moment ago, depending on the type of psychopathology, in some cases both are represented in the symptom itself, in some cases it's in a sequence, and but as you see, that's very much there. Here he says in the next paragraph, several years later, this is Mrs. Dansky talking, he wrote, quote, "We discovered by analyzing the symptom in hysteria," that's her interpolation, "which has been produced that these normal thoughts have been submitted to a normal treatment. They have been transformed into the symptom by means of condensation and deformation of compromises, by way of superficial association and in disregard of contradictions, and also it may be along the path of regression." All of it is what you heard about the dream work, isn't it? Very similar. In view of the complete identity between the characteristic features of the dream work and those of the psychical activity which issues in psychoneurotic symptoms, we feel justified in carrying over to dreams the conclusions we have been led to by hysteria. He wrote that in the interpretation of dreams, yeah. Okay. Here is another one, interesting one. This is from 1923. And here he says, "We find a struggle between two trends in both dreams and symptoms." It's at the end of page 9. "In both dreams and symptoms, we find a struggle between two trends of which one is unconscious and ordinarily repressed and strives towards satisfaction, that is, wish fulfillment, while the other, belonging probably to the conscious ego, is disapproving and repressive. The outcome of this conflict is a compromise formation, the dream or the symptom, in which both trends have found an incomplete expression. The theoretical importance of this conformity between dreams and symptoms is illuminating. Since dreams are not pathological phenomena, the fact shows that the mental mechanisms which produce the symptoms of illness are equally present in normal mental life, that the same uniform law embraces both the normal and the abnormal, and that the findings of research into neurotics or psychotics cannot be without significance for our understanding of the health mind, the health of the mind. Understand? The similarities are always very much highlighted, you know. Okay, what else? There is here a part of it that is not actually singled out, but it really refers to fantasies and symptoms, and it's at the age of page 10. Had we continued to develop this manuscript, that would have been the heading of that section. And there is a lot about fantasy and symptom formation, what role they play, you know. And as you know, Freud frequently thought that certain activities, artistic activities, literary activities, for example, which in fact is the development of the fantasy life of the writer, for example, may save him from developing a florid neurosis, you know. Okay, then there is anxiety and symptoms, which we just talked about. That at the beginning, there was an interesting theory, which I don't know if you're aware of. For a long time, Freud thought that anxiety was a transformation of repressed sexual drive. It got transformed into anxiety, and there is some truth to that. You know, people that practice coitus interruptus frequently suffer from severe anxiety. It's not an uncommon finding, and he used to refer to that many years ago. And the idea has been abandoned, but I can tell you, I'm a psychiatrist, and I have seen that any number of times, that people that practice, particularly the male, that practices coitus interruptus can develop an anxiety disorder very severe. And it's usually correctable. And this is people that tend to withdraw before the ejaculation so as not to produce a pregnancy, which is nonsense, because men leak and can produce a pregnancy even if they have not ejaculated yet. But generally speaking, of course, it is ejaculate that will produce a pregnancy. But for men who use that practice, it's not uncommon to suffer from anxiety disorder. And if they change the practice, the anxiety disappears. So you hear that, with that history, tell them don't do that, wear condoms or give your wife a pill or whatever you want to do, and that will solve the problem. It's interesting. I believe that's the case. In any case, he says, so the theory originally was that anxiety was the sexual drive being contained, that transformed itself into anxiety. So she says here, after Freud had given up the theory of the transformation of the libido into anxiety and put forward the signal anxiety theory, he writes that anxiety is a reaction to a situation of danger. It is obviated by the ego's doing something to avoid that situation or to withdraw from it. Symptoms are created so as to avoid a dangerous situation whose presence has been signaled by the generation of anxiety. And that's in Inhibitions, Symptom, and Anxiety, as you see in 1926, which is where Inhibitions, Symptoms, and Anxiety was described. And incidentally, this is one of the cornerstones of psychoanalysis, I don't know if I ever told you this, but they go this way. The studies on hysteria in 1895, the theory of dreams in 1900, if you have to read to create the basic structure of the psychoanalytic building, this is the way you should do it. Read the studies on hysteria, which are from 1895, the dream theory from 1900, the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, which is 1905, the papers on metapsychology, which are from 1914, Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920, The Ego and the Id in 1923, Inhibitions, Symptom, and Anxiety in 1926. And these are the very basic ones. Now, if you want to round it up, then read the outline of psychoanalysis in 1939, which was written shortly before his death, and was a kind of recopilation. But it's important, but less important than the others. Now, in between, there are 24 volumes of writing. This yet gives you the substance, because these are the cornerstones. These are the places at which psychoanalysis took a different turn, or other dimension that was not present and completely changed the nature of the theory. He now says, and this is interesting, in the middle of page 12, anxiety development and symptom formation were thought by Freud to be interchangeable. And this is a quote. The agoraphobia, for example, begins his illness with an attack of anxiety in the street. This is repeated every time he walks along the street. Again, he now developed a symptom, street phobia, which can also be described as an inhibition or a functional restriction of the ego. And thus he preserved himself from anxiety attacks, but at the expense of having created an inhibition. He cannot go into the street any longer, all right? One can observe the reverse process if one interferes with the formation of symptoms, or, as is possible, for instance, in the case of obsessive acts, if one prevents a patient from carrying out his washing ceremonial, he is thrown into an intolerable state of anxiety against which his symptom has obviously protected him. And that's true. If you interrupt a ceremonial of an obsession, he gets incredibly anxious. Indeed, some of the ceremonials are so ridiculous, and they are practiced by people that are, PhD degrees in philosophy or physics, and yet they are doing things that are absurd. And you say, well, do you believe that? He said, no. Of course not. He said, well, what do you do with them? He said, because if I don't, I get incredibly anxious, and the only way of not being anxious is by performing the ceremonial. That's why he's saying that if you stop the ceremonial, the anxiety breaks through, and that's true. That's absolutely correct. That's why these people will do sometimes outrageous kind of rituals and ceremonials, which are completely out of character with who they are and their education and the rest of it. And when you ask them, you say, why do you do that? Do you really think that because if you don't do this, a truck will run over your child? And he said, no. But the anxiety starts to increase, that the only way I have to control is by performing the ceremonial, absurd as it is, and that's true. Now, talking about inhibitions. Inhibitions is a form of symptom, right? But instead of being a typical type of symptom, it's like what he described in the agoraphobic type of patient. It's a restriction of an ego function, And that's a symptom as well, but it's in a different dimension of symptom. It restricts the ego in a different kind of way. It deprives.
Sense of omission.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. It deprives the ego of the capacity to perform certain functions that it should be able to perform. And that's not an uncommon solution, And there are any number of these things. If writer's cramp, for example, pianist cramp, or whatever, there are any number of these things that are of that type. Okay, now an important point is the overdetermination of symptoms, which you were referring to earlier, Tom. Symptoms, generally speaking, are very overdetermined. There are very many layers to it. And that's particularly true of certain type of psychopathology. For example, an obsessional. Yeah? An obsessional has a core conflict, which is what triggered off the first layer of symptoms, and then it's like an onion. As time goes by, that first layer of the onion becomes useless. So another layer is put over that one, and then another layer, and then another layer. After 20 years, you have an onion this big with 50 layers on it. Now, and this is a problem, because when you treat these patients, you have to go layer by layer. You take this layer and say, ooh, we did a terrific piece of work. We understood what that is. It doesn't have that symptom. 2 or 3 days later, the other layer symptom comes into the foreground. And you say, what is this? Where does this come from? The patient may well tell you then, I didn't remember, but 4 years ago, these were my symptoms. And then you have to go through that layer. And you peel that one, and again, it's gone, and you say, wow, we're in business. No, a few days later, the next symptoms of layers will, until you get to the core, And so, as you see, this idea of the overdetermination of symptoms is always true in certain forms of psychopathology because of the way that the symptoms develop through time and the many displacements that takes place, you have to do like in the dream, undo, go back so that you can see what was at the origin of it. Okay. To give you some idea of this, a symptom, he says, has more than one meaning. This is a quote. And serves to represent several unconscious mental processes simultaneously. A single unconscious mental process will scarcely ever suffice for the production of a symptom. And that's a quote from, I believe, is a case of hysteria. Then a little later he said, Freud discusses the complexity of a symptom. In treatment, the whole analysis is needed to explain a single symptom. Quote, the main symptom, perhaps, in the course of the treatment, one must endeavor to lay hold first of this, then of that, fragment of the symptoms meaning, one after another, until they can all be pieced together. That's on the papers on technique, which are around the time that he wrote the papers on metapsychology. Yeah. Now, the next section that she covers is the relationship of the component instincts and the symptoms. Here, we're back at what we were discussing when we were talking, remember, developmental interferences, developmental conflicts, neurotic conflicts, and fixation and regression and so on, and how, when you are doing this, it's not good enough to go and say, oh, he's fixated in this oral phase. That's good, but it's not good enough. Then you have to try and say, well, what component instincts is he fixated? One of the many component instincts is that he's having a conflict with, because it's not necessarily with all of them. It may be with a very specific one. And until you get to that one, you are running around the periphery of the problem, but never getting to the problem, And of course, a real structural change cannot take place until you get there. And that is dealt with, So it is very important to do that. And obviously the role of the component instincts is tremendous in the formation of the neurosis, because these conflicts, as you know, take place during the phases of development, oral, anal, phallic, and and each one has any number of component instincts. And if there is a conflict there that is not mastered, in other words, is that instinct is not tamed in some word or sublimated or repressed or allowed to be gratified in ways that are socially acceptable and so on, you may well create the first or one of the neurotic conflicts, isolated conflicts that then become a confluence during the Oedipus complex and get organized into the neurosis where everybody is represented, all the fixation points are represented. Then in the symptomatology they create the symptoms, they give expression to the symptoms. We talked about that a little earlier. I told you that, for example, people with enormous amount of oral fixation, when they get to the phallic Oedipal phase and experience castration anxiety, the castration anxiety will be expressed in oral terms, not in phallic Oedipal terms. And so it goes, They get represented. There is an organization that is very economical from the point of view of the ego and very valuable. But in any case, the component instinct always play a significant role in symptom formation because they may be one side of the equation of the conflict, And as I told you earlier, it's not enough to say, oh, it's that phase. You need to go to the specific component instinct and whether it is a libidinal one or an aggressive one and so on, Now, regression and symptoms, we talk about that too. And you remember the significance that had. You can read some of the quotations by yourselves. But you remember we talk about how when you regress, let's say that your regression is at 5 or 6 years of age when you are dealing with your Oedipus complex and your contraction anxiety, and you can hold yourself there and you go back to the anal phase. Well, the conflict then is enormous because when you were on the way up, your ego was not sufficiently developed, and you certainly had no superego, to be enormously aroused by the intensity of your anal sadistic impulses, for example. But once you are 6 or 7, your ego is now cognitively aware of this, and the kind of rejection that will be raised by the environment, and your superego will be horrified at the degree of cruelty that you are capable of. You see what I mean? So, because the regression reinforces these impulses and they tend to be manifested, the reaction of the ego and the superego is horrendous. You see what I mean? So, the regressive process not only gives shape to the form of expression that the neurosis will acquire, will speak the language of the neurosis, because it goes to the fixation point, and that will be the language of the neurosis. The symptoms will belong to that particular phase. You can identify, you say, this man has regressed to this phase, and these symptoms are coming from there. And so, obviously, this type of phenomena of the regression always plays a very significant role, and that's why we dealt with it in extenso in previous sessions. Now, Inhibition and Symptoms, that's the book that I mentioned, Inhibition, Symptom, and Anxiety. Freud identifies inhibition as a continuum stretching from normality to pathology and defines then them as restrictions of the functions of the ego, which have been either imposed as a measure of precaution or brought about as a result of an impoverishment of energy. And we can see without difficulty in what respect an inhibition differs from a symptom. For a symptom cannot any longer be described as a process that takes place within or acts upon the ego. All right? And then he discusses the different types of inhibitions and some normal restrictions of certain functions, and they are within normally. It's like the character, like what we're saying with the character. Sometimes the character, taking something to the character as a solution to a conflict, if it is within reasonable limits, it's an asset. You know, if you become orderly, organized, punctual, and so on, it is fine. But then if you develop a washing compulsion, that's not normal anymore. That's a character disorder, yeah? Or rather, it's a symptomatic, florid kind of symptom. Now, he gives an example here that is from Little Hands. You dealt with Little Hands, right? Well, this is a nice example. This is the last one paragraph in page 14. He says, the ego renounces these functions, which are within its sphere, in order not to have to undertake fresh measures of repression, in order to avoid a conflict with the id. An example in the case of Little Hands was his inability to go out into the streets, an inhibition, a restriction which his ego had imposed on itself so as not to arouse the anxiety symptom. So you see, the inhibitions solves the problem of the symptom, substitutes for the symptom, but it implies an ego restriction of function. You know, that's interesting because when we were when I was in Hampstead, we were looking at the results of treatment of people that have been in our children, mostly in analysis for many years. And what we were trying to do was, because the sessions were detailed in exquisite detail, you know, all that happened, the interpretations that were given, and that video was. But you read through that very careful, trying to see when the changes took place and in relation to what interpretations and so on. And it was a way of trying to assess where the change took place and what was the interpretation that achieved that, or the set of interpretation. And all of that was very interesting. You could determine a lot of it by doing this. But one thing that we learned is that frequently what looked like an improvement was not. Was an inhibition type of solution. And the patient became asymptomatic, like Little Hands. In his case, it was very noticeable because he couldn't leave the house. There are other forms of this solution that are not so noticeable. We had a patient who was a very clever kid of about 14 years, and he had a healthy brain. He wanted to be a physicist, you know, and had the talent for it. And his father was maker of bags for women at a factory, and he despised his father for this activity. He had a big brain. He wanted to be but that of course put him in conflict with his father, and he developed very significant type of anxiety, was very frightened. Because essentially he was saying, you are an ass, I'm going to be bigger and better than you are, and I'm going to take mother away from you. That's what he was saying, you know. So in the end, you see, this boy wasn't treated, he did very well. All the anxiety disappeared. But when we look at it, what happened was that he finally identified with the father, abandoned his interest in being a physicist, and was going to follow in the father's footsteps and just make women bags. You see what I mean? That solved the problem. And that it was an inhibition, a severe ego inhibition, but very difficult to notice. Very difficult to notice because it's kind of quiet, it's silent, you know. But that is not uncommon. That is not uncommon.
Then would it be likely that he would develop some kind of depression?
No, he accepted the inhibition in order to get rid of the anxiety, and it was, in fact, it was a happy solution as far as he was concerned, because the anxiety was overwhelming, you see. But what is important is that in order to do that, he had to give up his ideals, which were legitimate, and the reason why he had to do it is because he got caught into his Oedipus rivalry And so the pursuit of that ideal was too aggressive and too destructive of the father, and he couldn't do it, So he said, by making an identification with the father and doing what the father was doing and giving up his ambition, that resolved the conflict. But was that better? Was he better? Symptomatically, he was better. In reality, I don't think he was better because he was at the expense of not pursuing his talents. Okay. Then he talks about identification and symptoms, which is an interesting phenomenon, but you can read that. He talked too about trauma and symptoms. And again, you can read that. There is no much there, but all of this is very interesting. He then, or she then discusses some of the advantages of the symptoms and therapy and symptoms, And I think you can look at that. We have covered a lot of that already in the past, but it's not without interest. It's a very good review of the issue of symptom formation through Freud from the beginning till the end, how he changed his ideas and so on.
I really like the paper. I really enjoyed the paper.
Yeah, it's a very good
very,
paper.
very good.
But you know the amount of work that this implies. He had to go through the 24 volumes of Freud and select all the quotations and organize them in some kind of meaningful manner, and obviously she did it by subject, and that's why there are so many headings. And so I think it's an interesting paper. In fact, I'm going to clean it out and probably put it on the web page, because I never seen anything like this anywhere, actually.